the state of race relations in Britain. And there's no doubt that we have seen a social transformation of sorts following the police homicide of George Floyd in the US state of Minnesota. We saw Black Lives Matter demonstrations across the United States, but it wasn't confined to the United States. We saw in many other countries, including our own. And that has ultimately thrust issues of racial equality uh, to the forefront, you could say, when it comes to our national political and social discourse. And I do ultimately feel that's a good thing. I feel that Britain, when compared to other European countries such as France, Germany, the Netherlands, I do think we perform well when it comes to providing anti-discrimination protections on the grounds of race, ethnicity, and religion. We also have very successful ethnic minorities, especially in a socioeconomic sense. I think people of British people of Indian and Chinese origin are two ethnic groups that certainly spring to mind on that front. But the reality of the matter is there are particular ethnic groups who don't fare so well, especially when it comes to political trust, their lack of satisfaction in how the democratic system works. I think our fellow citizens of Black Caribbean origin would certainly be one broader ethnic category, you could say, which falls into that when it comes to a lack of trust in our democratic institutions, how they perceive the activities of local police forces, especially the London Metropolitan Police, as you know, especially with the almost the undercover operation into Stephen Lawrence's family following his racist murder. But I think that when we're looking more broadly at the UK, I think that we have made progress in terms of race relations since Stephen Lawrence's murder. I was 4 years of age. That was in 1994. We have made progress. There's no denying that. But I also feel that there's no room for complacency either when it comes to making progress on matters of race relations and racial equality. But I think we also need to be honest about what drives racial and ethnic disparities, differences in the UK. And I do feel that while we should talk about the responsiveness and the fairness, or rather the commitment to fairness within public institutions, but also institutions which operate in the private sector, I do also feel that we need to have a discussion about what goes on in a socio-cultural sense within ethnic minority communities. Myself, I'm of Bangladeshi Muslim origin. And when you look at levels of female unemployment within Britain's Pakistani and Bangladeshi origin communities, they are exceptionally high when compared to other ethnic groups. Now, is that purely down to anti-Muslim discrimination and gender discrimination in the labour market, or is that down to relatively conservative gender norms within particular communities, especially in how they perceive the role of women in British society? Those are difficult discussions. They're admittedly sensitive. And I think that when it comes to family structure, I'm quite a traditional man. I feel that if someone has, rather, if someone belongs to a strong family unit, I think that's a huge advantage to have in life. And the reality of the matter is, while we have plenty of single parents in the UK who have done an outstanding job in terms of raising their children, there is a certain advantage, or rather there are relative advantages attached to belonging to a stable family unit, which is ultimately headed by a married couple, ultimately two-parent households. And if you see recent ONS data, 6% of Indian origin dependents up to the age of 15 years, only 6% live in a lone parent household. That goes up to 63% for their peers of Black Caribbean origin. And I think that's an astonishing difference. And I think those kind of disparities need to be discussed. I do feel that family dynamics and community structure, that needs to play a bigger part in our discussions on racial and ethnic disparities, as well as our conversations on how public and private sector institutions need to be more responsive and need to strengthen their commitment to social justice and how they can respond to the diversity of needs in our multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-faith population. So all in all, I would say that if you look at in terms of international standards, you could say Britain is doing fairly well when it comes to matters of racial equality, but I'm not sure that will be of much benefit if you say that to a young lad of Black Caribbean origin in Haringey, for example, to say that, well, you're actually better off than someone who lives in Marseille or Rotterdam or even in Barcelona. Ultimately, his frame of reference will be exclusively British. So the point is there that we need to try a lot harder. We need to make greater strides in terms of really strengthening equality of opportunity and trying to create a more meritocratic society, whether that's employment opportunities, educational opportunities. By the way, in terms of educational opportunities, I think we have to talk about the relatively poor outcomes among white working class male pupils. That needs to be discussed. And in terms of how people relate to their public institutions, because ultimately what you want is a more democratically satisfied and a more socially stable society. And that's something that desire, that commitment is shared across a range of groups. And we really need to work towards achieving that.
I completely agree. One thing that if you could touch on, if you know
Sure.
anything about it, would be um, I'd say cross community interactions,
Mm,
especially talking about Black Caribbean groups. Um, I believe that they do face the most scrutiny, but also from, like, let's say, other Black continental African groups that
mm,
the UK. I think there's a lack in sort of like synergy with those two Black groups, and that just furthers that sort of like disparity even more. That just alienates other Black groups even more. Um,
mm.
is there anything you can sort of add to that, do you
I
think?
think that I think Angel, you've hit the nail on the head, and I think that when you look at data, you see these sort of overarching Black racial categories, but it masks very real differences between different Black ethnic groups. I'd even make the point the Black African category could include an established West African migrant of Nigerian Christian origin, and it could also include a recently arrived refugee from the Horn of Africa who might follow Islam. But yet the two would be included in the same Black African category. I think in terms of looking at community relations within the broader Black British population, there's no secret that there is a section of the Black Caribbean origin population which isn't particularly friendly towards people of Black African origin, and vice versa. I think that is the reality of the matter. I also feel that with the rise of BLM, we have also seen the emergence of an intra-Black hostility, you could say. There'd be you'd have certain individuals in the Black British population who might say, well, this is ultimately the politics of victimhood, and you may have other Black people saying that, well, really, you're ultimately brushing racial inequalities under the carpet. And I think you do see those conversations, or rather, you can see those social tensions at play within the Black British population. So I think what it really calls for is having these discussions in a robust. It has to be a robust conversation. Otherwise, you can't make much progress. But it's important to conduct that in a civil manner. Now, I'm on Twitter, and Twitter and social media more generally can be a cesspit. But I've seen interactions between Black British people. I've seen racially loaded labels such as Uncle Tom, a coon, house Negro, the black executioner of white supremacy. I don't think these labels are particularly useful when it comes to discussing matters of race. I understand that there are people who live in Britain who feel that they live in a fundamentally racist society, and those people need to be heard. But people within that section of society need to realize that if they indulge in that kind of name calling out of frustration, that is ultimately a form of racism. I would say that if you're calling someone a coon, I don't see that as a political critique or something that's permissible under critical race theory. I think that's something that lowers the quality of our race relations conversation. And it can alienate people from that conversation as well, when really we need positive, inclusive discussions in order to make progress on matters of racial equality.
Absolutely, yeah, and I'd also say that the same thing happens, in the US as well. There's a sort of
Mm,
in the Black communities that obviously form from, like, I'd say, like the Caribbean and continental Africa. There's these sort of like there's the argument that people from the Caribbean deny being African, and that
mm,
sort of creates a massive divide where, some people are worse off than others because they're from
mm,
Africa rather from the Caribbean, and that just creates even more conflict. And on Twitter,
mm.
which I try to avoid, that's just where it all really like comes up to the surface, and people start hurling insults at each other, and that's
Oh,
that's not the conversation we need to happen.
no, not at all. I think that social media, especially racial abuse from anonymous, um, Twitter accounts, I think that's something that we actually need more government action on, if I'm being completely honest. I think on these kind of issues, and this is actually the Sewell report published by the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities. It is a controversial report, to say the least, a divided opinion. But to be fair, it recommended that kind of online racist abuse um, from accounts, to be quite honest, keyboard warriors hiding behind their anonymous accounts, this should be treated as a public policy priority by the UK government. As something that we can discuss later on. I'm not sure what the UK government is doing well on which area of public policy the UK government is doing well in at the moment. But it's very clear that the government has received much advice. There were policy recommendations in the report, some of which were recommendations which have been made in previous reports and previous government commissioned reviews. And I think it's time for the government to really pay attention to those recommendations made. There's no point just paying lip service. And if I'm talking more generally in terms of members of the government, we have to realize that the Prime Minister, for example, Boris Johnson, he's made comments in the past which have not been forgotten by members of the Black British population, if I'm being completely honest. So they might have to work that extra, they might have to put that extra bit of effort in because of statements that they have personally made in the past. He's also compared British Muslim women who wear the niqab to a criminal law-breaking bank robbers, which I don't think is entirely helpful. So I think what we need to see the UK government actually pay attention to what's being said in reports that it commissions and ultimately take those recommendations on board and put them into practice, implement them, and then we can see how successful they are in terms of creating, or rather addressing, racial and ethnic disparities which exist in Britain.
Absolutely. You mentioned before you're talking about discrepancies in education and educational opportunities. Was that something
Mm.
you wanted to expand on?
I think so. If I talk a little bit about my own background, but I won't make it all about me. But I think this is something that is quite important to know. I'm from a predominantly working class town, lived in Luton all my life. Um, One thing I'll say, the biggest advantage I've had in life is the family that I belong to. I had, I've been blessed with the parents that I have. It's a very stable, loving, but also very hard-nosed, well-structured family unit as well, and that keeps you on the straight and narrow, to be honest. And I feel beyond that, I mean, that's the core. That's the ultimate source of rootedness I had in my life and continue to have in my life. But I was also part of a local community that took an interest in how I was doing. So I would go to the local Asian grocers. They'd ask me how I'm doing at school, how did my recent exams go? And you don't want to be the one who says that actually I flunked my exams, because that's very embarrassing. And I think that almost creates a healthy pressure in a way. It's good because as a young person, you feel like you're valued, like someone's taking an interest in your academic progress. There's also a pride there. There's almost like a family honor dynamic there as well, that you don't want to be the one who said, well, actually, I got all E's in my GCSEs. So I don't know what I'm going to do with myself. You don't want to be that person. And I think this continued even during my journey in university as well. So I think when it comes to educational outcomes, you see there that white working class boys in particular performing quite badly. They are being left behind. But I feel that there's all these, there are discussions about, this is the concept of white privilege at play at schools. This is having an impact. We can come on to the concept of white privilege later on, why I feel it's slightly unhelpful to say the least. But we need to talk more about family breakdown. I'm sorry. I think that's something that many politicians are very reluctant to discuss in terms of the role it plays in social, economic, and educational outcomes. And the reality of the matter is that there's a good number of white working class boys. They belong to communities which have been shattered, especially by the market forces of globalization that atomized, those shared institutions that used to exist in those communities, they've disintegrated. So when I'm talking about that feeling of rootedness that I had growing up, that doesn't necessarily exist for those young lads in those communities. And you see that I'm of Bangladeshi origin, but British Bangladeshi young people, they're notably more likely than a range of ethnic groups to be living in conditions of socioeconomic deprivation. But if you actually see that they're progressing quite well in an academic sense. And I do feel that even though they're living in fairly deprived neighborhoods, families are not particularly well off, but they're stable. And they have families that, even if their parents are not necessarily particularly well educated in a formal sense, they still encourage their children to do well at school. They keep a close eye on their academic progress, or maybe when they're not doing so well at school. And I feel that those dynamics are very important to have when we're discussing educational outcomes among young people. I think schools themselves, I think in certain parts of the country, they are bursting at the seams, to be honest. The school systems, under-resourced. I'm someone who believes that government austerity has been disastrous for some communities in this country. It's hit those communities which were left behind to begin with. They didn't really reap the rewards of free market globalism, and then on top of that, they had government austerity to cope with for the best part of a decade. So there's many factors at play when we're looking at educational outcomes, and well, there's no magic bullet. There's no magic bullet. There has to be meaningful policy changes in a range of areas in order to boost educational outcomes across Britain.
That's really interesting. Thank you for that. Moving back to white privilege. So just to throw the question out there, do you believe that white privilege actually excludes some white people, leaves them behind in that, do you understand what I mean? So like,
absolutely. I think Angel can agree more. I mean, I've talked a great deal why I feel that it's a very unhelpful concept from an anti-racism perspective. If you want to make progress in terms of racial equality in this country, you're going to have to bring some white people with you along the way, because they very much represent the majority in society. And I make this point particularly when we look at electoral politics. If you want a Labour government which makes significant improvements in terms of racial equality, they're going to have to win in those red wall constituencies that they lost in the last general election. It's just basic mental arithmetic. Without those seats, Labour can't get into, the left can't get into government, and it can't enact an ambitious policy program which looks to boost racial equality in our country. I think the concept of white privilege, the problem here is that there are severely underprivileged white communities in the UK. Now, as I said, without those communities, firstly, it's very unlikely that a Labour government can ever return to power. But when they hear white privilege, it really ignores the very serious class dynamics within the white British population. There's some very serious class tensions within the white British population. I think you could see that with Brexit, if I'm being honest. If you actually looked at the most severe tensions, it was between a middle class Remain voting, members of the white British population, and working class Brexit voting members of the white British population. There's some very serious, it's almost like sort of intra-white class-based warfare there, but just coalescing around Brexit. And I almost feel that when you're talking about the concept of white privilege, it really, another point what it does, it racializes forms of disadvantage when we should be, as I said, I mean, I know I talk about it a fair bit, but things like family structure, community dynamics, those are very meaningful sources of advantage, or rather disadvantage. And I feel that when we develop these, well, rather when we look at these concepts of white privilege, which they've accelerated in terms of popularity, especially on the left, it doesn't really do much in terms of trying to cultivate an ambitious anti-racism movement. And with the anti-racism movement, you need to talk to people out there. It's not just about talking with people within it. So I think I'll make this point that there are instances where there are instances where we've had police forces, when they're handling very serious cases of child sexual abuse, where they've been reluctant to really address them robustly because the victims might have been, say, white working class girls, and the perpetrators were of a non-white background. So when you look at that dynamic and you see there's almost a political correctness at play there over a very serious issue, there's not much white privilege to be had in that particular situation. So the point I make there, it might sound very, it might be very trendy and fashionable in some circles, but in the areas where you do need to cultivate support for a broader anti-racism agenda, you peddle concepts such as white privilege, you will alienate people, and that's not what the anti-racism movement should be looking to do.
Definitely. I think very poor like white working class families have a lot in common with working class immigrant families, because they share in the same struggles, but through media, like, it's been perpetrated that they should be against each other at all odds. It's they're taking our jobs and all that kind of thing, rather than coming together as a community sharing in the same struggles. They always tend to be at each other's necks, which is quite unfortunate. And I don't think there is a discussion we can have to bring them together. I think it's so steadfast now.
I think it's difficult because I think at the moment that race is talked about a lot more than class. And I think it's really interesting because racial identity is a clearly specified protected characteristic in equality legislation in the UK. But class isn't, which I've always found quite interesting, actually, because I do think that there's some very serious class-based barriers which can continue to persist in modern day Britain. I think what you talk about there in terms of class solidarity, you could say, or rather lack of class solidarity, I agree with you. I think that many of the problems that deprived ethnic minority communities in Luton will experience are not too dissimilar to the struggles experienced by white working class communities in places such as Hartlepool, like up near County Durham in the northeast of England. Problems such as poorly funded public services, problems surrounding insecure employment, a lack of investment in skills and apprenticeships. So those kind of issues, they are common problems, you could say, which cut across a range of communities. But our discourse is so racialized at the moment, or rather there's been an aggressive re-racialization of our sort of social relations, you could say. Yeah, I would say to an extent, class solidarity among working class communities, or rather working class sections of the population, have been undermined. I think that if you see the C2D social grade, the vast majority, well, rather a notable section of the white British population that falls in that social grade would vote Conservative, and non-white British voters who fall into that social grade will predominantly vote Labour. And I think that pretty much demonstrates how there is a lack of working class solidarity on a national level. And and if I'm being perfectly honest, I think that's something that Labour should be worried about. Labour was ultimately formed to represent the interests of working class people, to give them representation in the workplace. So if they are falling behind the Conservative Party among working class voters, then that's something that they should have a hard look at themselves, because that is very much a betrayal of their institutional origins.
Yeah, absolutely. Before I ask this, I'm just gonna open up questions to everyone. Just put them in the
Sure.
chat, and we'll ask questions as they come in. Um, but I'll also ask, do you think it's also, not to generalize this, but I've seen it in my personal experience. Do you think there's like a north-south divide in the UK about what is focused on more? Um, because in my experience, you know, the north tends to focus a lot more on class, whereas the south tends to focus a lot more on race. Do you think that's actually a thing?
Um, I wonder if it's a north-south divide, or is it a rural-urban divide? Now, I think that how inequality is discussed in I wouldn't use Bolsover because that's technically the East Midlands. Let me take, for example, Sedgefield in County Durham. I wonder how inequality is discussed there when compared with inner city Newcastle. They're not that far away from one another. They're both technically in the same region. So I do wonder whether whether it's a north-south divide, or is it more an urban, not urban rural, but more a kind of inner city versus provincial divide, if you put it that way. And I do feel I can talk a bit. I can talk a bit more about London because I don't live too far away from London. London discussions surrounding equality are heavily racialized. While I would say in Luton, it's still more class, even though I could take a 22-minute train, and I'll be at King's Cross St Pancras from Luton. So I think it's not so much this broader North versus South dynamic in terms of how equality is discussed. I think it depends more on the kind of place you live. If I'm being honest, the ethnic demography might come into it, but I'd make the point that Luton is a hell of a lot more diverse than many parts of London. But there's more of a discussion on class barriers. That's an anecdotal experience, or rather anecdotal account, you could say. So I would make the point that in terms of how but it's a very important point that you made, because it'd be very interesting to see, say if you did a survey, a nationwide survey, when people ultimately think about inequality, what vectors of inequality do they think about first? I would imagine if you live in an inner city area, it'd probably be more race. Well, if it's more in more provincial slash rural area, it might be more based on class. That'd be my hunch. Maybe it's something I'll propose to a polling organization and they can run it themselves and we can have some interesting results from that.
Yeah, that'd be really interesting. I'd love to see the results of that. Joe has a question he'd like to ask himself.
Okay, far
Sorry,
away, Joe.
do you think that Britain should adopt more of a Central Asian view on race? Because in Central Asia, for example, if you live in Uzbekistan, you are considered Uzbek. And for example, I realized I was doing a bit of research and I realized the national manager of Uzbekistan, football manager, was from a group, an ethnic group that was murdered in the 1990s, but no one talks about it, and no one, like, there was no articles, there was no one talking about it. Do you think we should adopt that mode of kind of trying to integration?
Yeah, I mean, Joe, I mean, I think you're probably the first person that's ever looked to Uzbekistan for community relations inspiration, and try in terms of trying to integrate that in the UK context. But I think what I would say is that if your point is more about trying to establish a, a form of civic nationalism which helps to bind together different ethnic groups, then I would support that. I think that when people hear the word nationalism, they automatically think about ethno-nationalism. There's different kinds of nationalism, and I feel that in the UK, I think what we suffer from, there's a lack of a common moral cultural standard. You hear this kind of idea of British values, but if you asked a select number of people what does British values mean to you, you get lots of different answers. And I think that probably tells you a story of how our political leadership, they talk a great deal about British values, but they very often don't articulate what they mean by it. And I think that is a very serious issue, because when you have a multi-ethnic, racially diverse population such as ours, you need a core set of principles to help bind those different groups together, because that helps to develop forms of social trust and mutual respect. So all in all, Joe, I'm sorry to have taken it away from Uzbekistan as quickly as I did, but I think you are to a degree onto something where, and I think I almost saw this with Emma Raducanu's US Open win. Fantastic, remarkable achievement. But straight away, you had such a strong emphasis on her Chinese and Romanian heritage. You'd almost be forgiven you'd almost be forgiven for forgetting that she was actually a British athlete, who was ultimately, much of her sporting development took place in Bromley. So I think that when you look at that particular case, what it does tell you is a story of Emma Raducanu coming from a very strong family background. She benefited from very robust local institutions such as Bromley Tennis Centre that played a great role in her development. She has a British coach in the form of Andrew Richardson. So you can almost tell, it's almost like there's almost an uplifting story to be told, a British success story rooted in family and community. But instead, we had people talking about her heritage, or immigrants are doing it again for the UK. I think I personally take great pride in my Bangladeshi and Indian Muslim heritage, but I don't want people to forget the fact that I'm ultimately a British man at the end of the day. So I think it's very important to think about how we present British successes. So all in all, Joe, I think that's a very interesting question, and I hope you're satisfied with my answer.
Thank you. Sorry, and I realise that it's probably not one that people kind of rush to ask, but yeah.
I'm very thankful you asked the question, Joe.
Thank you, Joe, for that. I've got quite a long one here. I might just try and summarise this.
Sure.
Do you have any policy suggestions that you're more likely to encourage a Conservative government to effect change? Or sort of in that, are there any areas of policy currently that you can think of that we can combine with race relations to make like a viable policy package that you could introduce with a Conservative government now?
I think with the Conservative government, it's a lot of it's about language. I don't think trying to strengthen equality of opportunity is woke. I actually think that's a quite classically conservative aspiration that taps into that classic British promise of fairness. That strong sense of fair play, which I mean, I've always felt that that's something that's ingrained in British culture more than anything. And the reality of the matter is we have a Conservative government with quite a strong parliamentary majority. I think it's its largest one since 1987, which was Margaret Thatcher's third general election victory. So we're talking about something that was quite a while ago. But I think I do wonder, is it the case that more people from the anti-racism movement, do they put all their cards in with, or rather put all their chips in with the Labour Party, which is still significantly behind in most polling? Or do they actually try to work with the government, which has quite a strong parliamentary majority, a government which, even though I'm quite surprised, I feel they underperforms in a number of ways, but it continues to be ahead of Labour in a range of polling, in many polls. So I think it's a matter of boxing clever. How do you frame your racial equality objectives in conservative language? I think that's the key. So, for example, it'd be about generating opportunities to allow people to operate on a level playing field to maximize their individual initiative. Now, there's a lot of sort of social justice intention in that, but you can see how I framed that in quite conservative terms. Maybe I'm quite I find it quite easy to do that because in some ways I'm quite left wing, in other ways I'm quite right wing, so I'm quite able to do that. But I do feel that when it comes to the Conservative government, if they take meritocracy seriously, which I think quite historically they haven't, which is actually quite anti-conservative if you don't take meritocracy seriously, you want to create a situation where, for example, in the labor market, I've always felt that ethnic minority people, well, not so much ethnic minority people, but people with culturally distant names, I think are at a bit of a disadvantage. And there's a range of CV resume-based studies which showed that across a range of sectors, that if you have a culturally distant name compared to a traditionally English sounding name, you are at a bit of a disadvantage, even if you control for work experience, educational qualifications, skill set, etc. And I do feel that there needs to be a movement towards a more sort of name blind model for our labour market. And I think you have similar dynamics, unfortunately, in the sort of private rented housing sector as well, when it comes to those kind of applications. So I feel that that's the kind of thing where, and I'd make this point as well. If people's talents are not well matched to opportunities, the entire economy loses out in terms of wealth creation. I'm sorry to make this a wealth issue because this should ultimately be a social justice issue, but the reality of the matter is you can't really you can't really gain the attention of conservatives unless you talk a little bit about money. That's the truth of it. So I think there's a strong moral case, but a strong economic case for creating a more meritocratic society. Because firstly, we should be passionate about equality of opportunity, because it's important that people feel that they're operating on a level playing field. If they don't take up those opportunities when there's a level playing field, that's on them. That's individual failure as far as I'm concerned. But there is also a case where the government, the country as a whole, is losing out on a great amount of wealth. I think this was mentioned in the McGregor-Smith review, where she made the point that we're missing out on vast amounts of wealth creation because talented people aren't being matched to the opportunities where they could function in really well. So I think there's both a social and economic case, which you'd like to think there's almost, it could form the basis of a wealth creating anti-racist conservatism, you could say.
Yeah, really, really interesting. Thank you for that. Last question I have here. Why do race essentialists never talk about the underachievement of working class white boys in education and other areas?
Well, it's something that I talked about, but I'm not a race essentialist. I think that comes to the point where white privilege does that, unfortunately. What it does, it looks at British social relations in a very binary way. It's almost oppressive white versus oppressed non-white. And I think that's so incredibly simplistic and reductive, where you ultimately look at you almost look at the British economy, for example, as some kind of sort of white privilege superstructure, when in reality some of the most severe forms of disadvantage, social and economic, exist among white working class community, within white working class communities. And I'll always believe that, as I said, family dynamics play a very strong part in one's life chances and their personal development. And as I said, in certain communities, especially white working class communities in post-industrial areas, you'll see there that there are relatively high levels of family breakdown. So if you put all of that together, we're talking about young people who are quite socially, at first, they don't have much of a stable situation at home, which is hugely problematic, and they're part of communities which are atomized. There's not those kind of those kind of shared bonds of affection. They don't exist in a number of those communities, and I think that's hugely problematic. And as we discussed, Angel, in terms of government austerity, under-resourced public services, schools which are seriously struggling, you put all of those factors, you put all of those circumstances together, and you're painting a very depressing picture. And that picture is not exclusively in non-white communities. It also exists within white British communities.
Thank you. I think that answered that very well.
Thank you.
That was the last question. If anyone wants to put any more in chat, but Dr. Rakib, if you have anything else to add to this, any other like
Yeah, I think that ultimately, firstly, I'd really like to thank University of York for putting up this event. I'm always delighted to speak at events like this, because I feel that the only way we can make progress on these admittedly sensitive topics is if we discuss them in an open forum such as this, in a robust. I think it's been a very robust conversation, but I think it's been conducted in a civil way, and I think that's the key. And I feel in recent times, I do feel that we're losing that to an extent. I think all too often people, which I understand, because passions can run high when we're discussing these kind of issues, but there has to be a degree of understanding and patience. Otherwise, as a society, we're not going to make the kind of progress we want when it comes to matters of fairness and opportunity. But all in all, what I would say is that I think Britain has a reasonably strong basis when you're looking at international standards. I think we're very much a European leader when it comes to the provision of anti-discrimination protections and race relations more generally. But that's not to say that improvements can't be made. There are improvements to be made. I even think that when you see statistics such as rates of maternal mortality being 4 times higher among Black British women compared to white British women, there's a range of factors at play there. But the point is that needs to be investigated. That's a very serious disparity. Now, it might be the fact that this has very little to do with what's going on within hospitals, but I suspect that maternal care would definitely come into that. I've also read accounts where within Black British communities, there's almost a sense of feeling that, or rather that Black British women, a certain section within those communities, it's almost about masking pain or not showing it because it's seen as culturally alien to do so. But the point is, we need to talk about those issues, because if you're having that, I'd make the point, the rate of maternal mortality overall is very low in Britain compared to other countries, on an international level. But when you have those kind of racial and ethnic disparities, people are within their right to ask why that disparity exists. And we shouldn't be sensitive about those kind of topics. We need to talk about them, and they need to be better investigated. So all in all, and when you look at, for example, unemployment rates within Black British communities, I think for the 16 to 25 age bracket, it's over 40%. That is remarkable, and much of that is because traditionally Black British young people tend to have more precarious forms of employment if they're not unemployed to begin with. I also feel that career advice in certain communities could be better improved, that career advice infrastructure. These kind of figures are not sustainable. They're really not. And I'm not trying to be alarmist. I just think that is an unacceptable state of affairs. So these kind of things really need to be discussed. We need to have an honest conversation about them. And the quicker we do that, the quicker we can address the root causes of those disparities. So all in all, I'd say that it's a relatively positive picture when you compare the UK to other countries, especially EU member states. I will sound a bit Brexity and say that those kind of tolerant EU versus intolerant Britain narratives, they are to a degree quite simplistic. But we should not rest on our laurels and become complacent when it comes to matters of racial equality. We need to be more, we need to take the existence of racial and ethnic disparities more seriously, and we need to find out why they exist. And once we make headway on that front, we should be in the business of designing and implementing meaningful policies which help to address those disparities.
Well, thank you so much for contributing to such an important conversation that we all need to be having. I'd like to thank you so much for coming to this talk.
My
It's
absolute
been
pleasure.
fantastic. Thank you to everyone that came.
And I'll make the point, Angel, I think considering you stepped in at such short notice, you did a fine job of chairing the event. So I thank you for that.
Thank you. So thank you everyone for coming. It's been absolutely fantastic. Hopefully see you all at the next Pulsar event.
Bye all. Thank you for having me.